Thank you, General. Operation Heritage was born early in 2008 from discussions held between General White-Spanner, commanding the Multinational Division South East in Basra, and Dr. Neil McGregor, Director of the British Museum, to discuss the feasibility of the British Army and the British Museum working jointly to assist the Iraqi Ministry of State for Antiquities and Tourism in developing a cultural heritage project in southern Iraq. From the outset, Operation Heritage's aim was to identify key heritage sites and museums in southern Iraq, assess what state they were in, and in coordination with the Iraqi authorities and the British Museum, to implement a plan to safeguard these sites and museums. As military assistant to General White-Spanner in Basra, I was identified jointly with Dr. Curtis, keeper of the Middle Eastern Department of the British Museum, as the project manager. Together, we drew up a plan for the project with 9 initial objectives. To seek approval from the government of Iraq for the project, to establish liaison between the British Museum, the British Army, and the Iraqi Ministry of State for Antiquities and Tourism, secure funding for the different aspects of the project, nominate the important cultural heritage sites in southern Iraq and carry out assessments with a team of experts, establish training courses for museum curators at the British Museum, assess security at key heritage sites, assist with and help to coordinate infrastructure repair as required, liaise with government of Iraq ministries and other coalition partners to ensure there is a coordinated approach on heritage issues pan-Iraq, and to gain international awareness and support for this important initiative by promoting media coverage. It was decided at the stage to split Operation Heritage into 2 parts. Firstly, Operation Sumeria, which aimed to identify key heritage sites in southern Iraq and assess what condition they were in. And second, Operation Bell, which aimed to establish the location, fund, and refurbish a museum for Basra. Operation Sumeria. As the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia contains many sites of great significance. The British Museum identified a number of the more important sites, and then, with the assistance of the military, prioritised these sites further by studying the availability of access to them and the time frame one would have to visit them, particularly when utilising a military helicopter, which would have to be freed up for a short duration from other important tasks. John Curtis conducted a short scoping visit to Basra in April 2008, visiting both and Eridu and overflying Uruk. The film footage and photography taken by the British Army's combat camera team proved invaluable and was shown at the Iraqi Heritage Working Group organised at the British Museum. Planning for a larger expedition in June to carry out more detailed assessments took place during this visit with the aspiration to visit Eridu, Uruk, Kisiga, Lhasa, Lagash, Tel El-Weli and Ubaid. Significant time and detail went into planning the June trip. All locations had to be confirmed, assisted by acquiring satellite imagery of these sites. It was planned to forward base the team to the west of Basra in Talil, hosted by the United States military. Time was well spent beforehand, with Dr. Curtis and his archaeological team informing the crew of what needed to be achieved, the different types of aerial imagery required, and the best landing sites for the helicopters so as not to damage any of the heritage sites. Authority for the site visits was granted by the Ministry of State for Antiquities and Tourism. Security and communications requirements were assessed beforehand in Basra, and the relevant personnel and equipment were attached to the team for the duration of the trip. The team with the helicopter crew was 25 strong. The archaeological experts were coordinated by Dr. Curtis and included Dr. Paul Collins from the British Museum, Dr. Margaret Van Ness from the German Institute of Archaeology in Berlin, Elizabeth Stone from the State University of New York, and from the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Tourism, we had Mr. Qais Hussein Rahid, the Director of Investigations and Excavations, Mr. Mezzin Ali, Deputy Director of the Iraqi Museums, and Mr. Abdulamir Al-Hamdani, the Inspector of Antiquities for Nasiriyah Province. Without the permissions, authority, advice and guidance of our Iraqi colleagues, we could not have achieved what we did during this trip. The military side of the team included myself, a Major Rupert Burridge from the Royal Engineers, a 5-man helicopter crew, a 7-man force protection squad, 2 signallers, a medic, and a 2-person combat camera team. I only mention all these figures because just to show you what it takes to visit 7 sites costs considerable amount of money and a considerable amount of manpower. Altogether, some 800 photographs were taken, and amongst them are some of the best photographs ever taken of the sites in question. These images, together with film footage, were passed to the British Museum for further use. At each site, the team were looking for evidence of looting and when it might have occurred, for evidence of military activity, whether before or after March 2003, and for evidence of damage deriving from nearly 30 years of neglect. In conclusion to the site visits, the team found that conditions were different at each site, so it was difficult and dangerous to generalise. The main purpose of the mission was to assess damage at the sites, and the damage observed can be categorised under four headings. Damage resulting from turning the sites into military defensive positions, damage to sites from coalition activities, damage from looting, and damage from neglect. A full report on all these locations has been compiled by the British Museum. Operation Bell. This was the other main focus of the project, and it was to identify museums in southern Iraq with a view to restoring them. The Ministry of State for Antiquities and Tourism had regained control of Basra Museum, but security in the area, though improved, was still a concern. Additionally, there was infrastructure damage to the building that would require significant work. To this end, and in liaison with the Ministry of State for Antiquities and Tourism, an alternative location was sought. It was understood that this location should have the required security for work to take place unhindered, as well as being a building of significance in the eyes of the Basrari people. The Lakeside Palace, built for Saddam Hussein, was such a place. Mr. Katan Abd Ali Al-Mayahi, the director of the Basra Museum, fully engaged with the project and was key from the very start in driving the project forward. It was agreed that the Ministry of State for Antiquities and Tourism would set up a committee for the project and seek approval for the reuse of the palace from Prime Minister Maliki. Soon afterwards, Prime Minister Maliki stated that it was his aspiration that Saddam's palaces should be turned into cultural centres. From the outset of Operation Bell, staff of the Ministry of State for Antiquities and Tourism took the lead in driving this project forward. The British Museum offered advice on how the palace could be made into a modern museum, and the British Army provided security and detailed survey of the building, including detailed floor plans of the museum. The role of the Army, as was planned, became redundant after troops had withdrawn from Basra. As the second most important city in Iraq, which in itself contains some of the most important heritage sites in the world, it is only right that such a building should be utilised to put this heritage on display, not only to the local and national community, but to the international community as well. The opening of such a museum in Basra will act as a springboard to further investment in other cultural attractions, which in turn would attract further economic growth, training and employment for the area. All of those involved with this initiative firmly believe that this project was worthwhile and in time may become a jewel in the Iraqi crown for the region and will attract considerable interest externally and substantive opportunities for the people of Basra. It is imperative that projects such as Operation Heritage are as indigenously led and advice must be sought at every juncture. The British Museum and the British Army are purely supporting elements. Strong relationships within the relevant departments are essential. In this case, relationships with the director of the Basra Museum and key members of the Ministry of State for Tourism and Archaeology have been invaluable. Additionally, a combined coalition effort on cultural projects would magnify the effect on the ground and demonstrate the importance of the country's heritage to others. In conclusion, thanks to the hard work of the Friends of Basra Museum and of Mr. Qatan Abd Ali Al-Mahi, the final works are being undertaken by Bur Al-Aman to complete the build of the museum, and the showcases have now been ordered from Rear in Dresden. The present focus will be to open one gallery in the museum out of a proposed 4 and an educational centre. It is intended that this gallery should be devoted to the history of Basra, with some material locally sourced and some coming from Baghdad. It is proposed that the launch will be in April 2016. It is hoped that the refurbishment of the rest of the building and the opening of the other 3 galleries will be paid for by Basra Provincial Council. Thank you. In 1942, museum conservator and monument man George Stout wrote, "As soldiers of the United Nations fight their way into lands once conquered and held by the enemy, the governments of the United Nations will encounter manifold problems. In areas torn by bombardment and fire are monuments cherished by the people of those countrysides or towns. Churches, shrines, statues, pictures, many kinds of works. To safeguard these things will not affect the course of battles, but it will affect the relations of invading armies and those peoples and their governments. To safeguard these things will show respect for the beliefs and customs of all men, and will bear witness that these things belong not only to a particular people, but also to the heritage of mankind." The protection of cultural property during the Second World War was viewed as a responsibility of competence. The Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives units were a team of cultural heritage experts fully integrated into the Allied forces. Being supported by Field Marshal Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, they became an active element of the Allied forces, and from their efforts had considerable effect in protecting and preserving important cultural property. Little was done in military or academic circles to sustain the work of the monuments men after the Second World War, and only superficial, if any, expertise existed in the majority of militaries until recently. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the international community produced the Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict of 1954, and an associated protocol. A second protocol to the convention was produced in 1999, following the destruction and deliberate targeting of cultural property in the former Yugoslavia. The convention remains the primary relevant international legislation concerning the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, underpinning the international humanitarian law in place for cultural property protection. Yet destruction and looting continue. In the last decade alone, we have witnessed significant damage to cultural property in Iraq and Afghanistan, and more recently in Syria, Mali, and Egypt. Momentum is now building towards ratification of the Hague Convention by the UK, and this will ensure that protecting cultural property will become a legal obligation of the British military in times of conflict. Before solutions were found to close the cultural property protection capability gap existent within the military, it was important to establish the key reasons cultural property is damaged or destroyed during conflict. Firstly, a lack of planning and understanding, as demonstrated by multinational troops in Iraq building bases on archaeological sites. Secondly, the spoils of war. There are many examples in history of the spoils of war becoming the just deserts, and in some cases, the sole source of income of victorious armies. Interestingly, strategists over the last 2,500 years, including Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, have argued against this practice, stating that removing a vanquished foe's cultural property will cause long-term resentment in occupied territories and, in part, provide justification for future conflict. Thirdly, military mistakes. and this could include human or mechanical error or come from a lack of understanding. Fourthly, collateral damage. One only has to watch the news to witness the extensive and horrific damage that can be caused by fighting. Fifthly, looting. Looting and sale of illicit antiquities is often associated with the funding of conflict, and while dealing with the sale of illicit antiquities may not be an issue on which the military would necessarily lead, the prevention of looting during and immediately following conflict, and thus the strangulation of the trade, may well be a military responsibility and certainly a military force multiplier. And lastly, specific targeting. We have all witnessed the recent destruction of the Buddhas in Bamiyan, Afghanistan by the Taliban, the burning of the libraries in Timbuktu, Mali, and the destruction of significant sites in Syria by the Daesh. Irina Bokova, Director General of UNESCO, has branded the Daesh activists in this respect as a form of cultural cleansing. She stated, "Destroying culture hurts societies for the long term. Warlords know this. They target culture because it strikes to the heart and because it has powerful media value in an increasingly connected world. We saw this in the wars in the former Yugoslavia, where libraries were often burned first." With these specifics in mind, Professor Peter Stone, chairman of the United Kingdom Blue Shield, identified and introduced to the military a 4-tier cultural property protection approach, consisting of long-term awareness training, specific pre-deployment training, cooperation during conflict, and cooperation post-conflict. It prescribed a long-term strategy that would begin to indoctrinate cultural property protection into the military DNA. From this, the military have taken the following actions. Requirements for establishing cultural property protection professionals within the military have been drafted, along with training and role specifications. A military cultural property protection working group has been established at the Joint Services Defence Academy. Members are represented from the military, academia, and NGOs. Discussions and planning are ongoing in reference to the production of doctrine and the delivery of training to the wider military in cultural property protection. On top of this, the UK government has recently announced it is launching a cultural fund. This funding will be vital to success of a cultural property protection strategy and must be used to address coordination, training, proactive protection, emergency responses, and most importantly, long-term support. Irina Bokova has argued for a strengthening of national capacities, training for soldiers, more resources, experts on the ground, and better coordination with armed forces, Interpol, and other actors. Much of this is already being done by other military forces around the world, including the US, Netherlands, Austria, and Italy. NATO is currently looking into introducing cultural property protection doctrine. The benefits to resourcing cultural property protection in the military include the UK's moral obligation to communities amongst which it operates. Cultural property is the tangible, visible, and totemic cultural expression of a community, a society, and a nation, and there is a moral obligation for the Army to afford cultural property protection to it. Increased influence amongst the people, improved reputation locally and internationally, improved force protection through influence and reputation, improved cultural understanding of a region, and prevention of terrorist funding. Looted cultural property is understood to fund terrorism in theatres where UK forces have recently operated. It has been assessed that the Daesh have secured around $36 million from the sale of looted antiquities from Iraq and Syria. The combination of these cultural property protection benefits will preserve and enhance freedom of manoeuvre for the military. In summary, General White-Spunner, Dr. Curtis and I delivered a number of lectures over 7 years ago now on the importance of academia and the military working together, and the importance of the military being able to understand the intrinsic links of culture to the people they are operating amongst. There is now a demonstration of willing and proactivity from both parties. The momentum gained from this cooperation must not now be lost, and the concepts that are being planned have to be taken forward. Thank you.